The lurking of unattainable food is a common theme in part 2, such as when a classmate of Frank invites him and another boy to his house for lunch, only to have them watch him eat and give no food to Frank and the other boy. Frank and the other boy, Patty, outraged, decided to not go back to school on an empty stomach and end up stealing apples and milk from a nearby farm. With the boys' stomachs full, Frank hears disturbing news that his parents are looking for him and are angry. Patty and Frank rush back to Patty's house and hide out there for the night. At Patty's, Frank is disturbed by the bare feet and nakedness of Patty's siblings, and the hacking coming from Patty's disease-ridden father. The theme changes as the chapter continues from a lacking of food to disease, the theme being introduced by Patty's father. The author continues with a commentary from Frank as he sees his friend's siblings dying from consumption. Frank's commentary seems greedy and scary as he says, "I envy Mickey because every time someone dies in his family, he gets a week off from school." But McCourt, the author, is simply showing how horrific the famine and disease in Ireland affected people's attitudes towards life and death. Frank encounters a different type of disease when he meets Mr. Timony. At least considered disease in Ireland, Mr. Timony was a Buddhist. Mr. Timony asks Frank to read to him, and in this setting is where Frank discovers a new world outside of Ireland. Frank reads of distant and tropical lands such as India and finds his love of reading. The pleasant time Frank spends with Mr. Timony ends abruptly when the old man is checked into a mental hospital. Before chaos erupts, another child is brought into the McCourt family along with the hope that Malachi will stop drinking away the dole money. McCourt throws a curveball at the audience when the next person to enter a hospital is Frank. Already seeing 3 of the McCourt children die, Frank's admittance to the hospital for typhoid brings out many emotions in the reader. In the hospital, Frank meets a young girl and a kind janitor, Seamus. The young girl, Patricia, introduces Frank to new forms of literature, English poetry. Frank's time in the hospital is met with a whirlwind when he finds out that Patricia died, and when he is haunted by children who died from famine before him. After 14 long weeks, Frank gets to leave the hospital and is happy to feel a warm presence by the people of his neighborhood upon his return. Not too much later, Frank's happiness shifts to disappointment when he learns that he will have to retake his 5th year and be in the same class as his younger brother. Wishing for any way to change this, Frank slowly makes his way to the St. Francis statue to pray. Frank's prayers are answered after he writes a snarky essay about Jesus growing up in Limerick, which persuades his teacher to move him to 6th year. In 6th year, the teacher tells tales of battles between Ireland and England and how both sides were faulty. Frank is astonished by this concept of non-innocent Irish soldiers, especially since he has been taught to die for Ireland from his father. This brings about mixed emotions in Frank about his father and questioning of his morale. The rest of the chapter focuses on the terrible living conditions of Limerick during the 1920 to 1930s by using the example of the overflowing, rat and fly-infested neighborhood lavatory that brings great misery to the McCourt family. Next, the scenery of the neighborhood changes as families are slowly leaving poverty due to men going off to war in England. After some convincing and the McCourt family getting closer to complete starvation, Malachi reluctantly agrees to go to war. Frank, his siblings, and his mother happily send Malachi to England in the hope of having new clothes and ham for Christmas dinner. To no surprise, the McCourt family doesn't see a wink of money and continues to live in poverty. Frank returns home from the hospital after an eye infection to hear how his father has gone pure mad with the drink, leaving Angela desperate for charity. Angela is ridiculed by the dispensary and falls into sickness. To help his mother and aid his siblings, Frank begins stealing food and firewood with the support of his brothers. When a guard comes to the house, Angela is taken to the hospital, so the boys go to live with their Aunt Aggie. Aggie abuses the boys, bringing sadness to the boys and the reader. The boys are saved when Malachi returns from England to care for them, only to have to leave again when Angela comes home from the hospital. Still with no money, Frank witnesses his mother begging for food outside the church and begins to call her a beggar. McCourt ends part 2 with the feeling of disgrace as Frank refuses to go home because he realizes how horrible his life is.